The most famous and infamous axe murderer in history is Lizzie Andrew Borden. She allegedly axed her father and mother to death in their home on Thursday, August 4th, 1892. However, she was not the first woman to pick up an axe and kill her family. This is the story of the Cumberland Mountain Axe Murders that took place 48 years before the Borden murders and equally rocked the nation. One of Tennessee's most puzzling unsolved cases involving the O'Neill family in Overton County, Tennessee, on Friday, September 11th, 1846. Almost every source states that the murder took place on Tuesday, September 15th. This is actually not true, as it was the day that Patsy and her conspirators were arrested and started their wait for trial. We will now tell the story of Patsy O'Neill Troxdale and the death of her family. All aboard the Kentucky-Tennessee Living Time Machine. Please fasten your seatbelts and keep your arms and legs inside of the vehicle at all times. But to get going, we need your help. We still need to fire up that time machine to transport us. Please help us by clicking on the like, subscribe, and bell notification buttons down below. Not only does this fire up the time machine for our flight back in time, but it convinces the YouTube algorithm that we need a bigger vehicle to reach more people who love history as much as you do. Now, back to our story. Overton County, Tennessee. First, we will cover the area that the murders took place in. This will become very important as the story unfolds. Overton County, home of the modern-day city of Cookeville, is located on the Cumberland Plateau. The county straddles the eastern highland rim. The beautiful area sits on low, rolling hills that are divided by narrow creek valleys. The county has a total of 435 square miles, of which 433 square miles is land and 1.4 square miles is water, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. In 1846, this area did not have a lot of settlements and was not very densely populated. There were a couple of pioneer settlements, but they were sparsely populated. This would explain why the bodies of the O'Neill family was not discovered quickly and were not removed from the site as soon as they were discovered. The O'Neill family. Now that we have talked about the area that the murders had occurred, let's talk about the family that was involved. Edward O'Neill was a poor Appalachian farmer that owned a small tract of land at the foot of the Cumberland Mountain in Overton County, Tennessee. O'Neill was about 40 years old and made extra money as a day laborer. However, according to accounts, O'Neill loved to drink whiskey and would turn mean-spirited each time he went off on a bender. O'Neill was known to take his irritation, frustration, and violent behavior out on his wife Sarah and his elder daughter Patsy. There was Patsy and Jackson, who was the oldest son and about 12 years old, with 4 other children who are not named in any of the sources, being much younger and weaker. The ages of Patsy runs anywhere between 16 to 20 years old, and she was unmarried at the point in this story. She had a very wild nature and was often seen to accompany men along with drinking and other bad attributes. All of this was a point of contention between Patsy and her father. This is the layout of the O'Neill family home and buildings. The family lived in a small, old, dry cabin built from small, round logs. The floor was made of puncheons with a cellar underneath it that was 2.5 feet wide and 5 to 6 feet long. A short distance from the home was a small shed that served as a kitchen for the family. About 140 to 240 yards from the house was the fodder house. During the month of September 1846, it is said that the family was living in the fodder house. Patsy, it seems, was a handful. She was known to have several lovers all over the county, carried weapons from time to time, and had lewd behavior. At some point, it is said that Patsy moved out to the barn to avoid conflicts with her father. According to the ancestry source, quote, Patsy's intrigues were known to her father. He had threatened to thrash her, and she had threatened to take his life. He had given orders to her that she should not live on the place, and that she must seek her home by Monday, the Monday next succeeding the day on which she was murdered. Unquote. So, it seems that Edward had waited too late to try to reel in his daughter from her wayward path. The events of Friday, September 11th, 1846. Sometime during the day, Nicholas Stevens and William E. Upton paid a visit to the farm. Stevens and Upton were living in Cumberland Mountain, just 7 or 8 miles from the O'Neill farm. They were also poor farmers who were married, but also lewd in their personalities. When they left their home, they told their families that they were going to the O'Neill farm to get their money back from the purchase of a horse. There are some sources that state that the horse was either sickly or it died within a week of purchase from O'Neill. On their journey, they had stopped at a grocery store, which is a euphemism for a place that you can buy bootlegged whiskey or moonshine, which was 3.5 miles from the O'Neill cabin. They bought a half a gallon of whiskey, which they drank part of it, and took the rest of the bottle to the O'Neill farm with them. The 2 men were looking for Edward O'Neill, but instead came upon his wife, Sarah. She explained that O'Neill was not at home, that they should come back a little later. A source states that the men inquired about who was home, and Sarah told them that Patsy was digging ginseng. The men called up to her and made arrangements to stay at the barn with her for the night. So, where was Edward O'Neill? For the entire week, it seems that he had taken a job with a neighbor who lived 3 or 4 miles down the road to cut lumber for boards. After work, O'Neill had taken the path through the forest. From here, there are 2 conflicting stories. One story states that he bought some whiskey on his way home and got drunk. In another story, there was nowhere to buy whiskey on his way home, and no witnesses saw him on his journey. O'Neill had a job lined up for Saturday, September 12th, doing similar work for another neighbor. He did not show up for work that morning. Events back at the fodder house that evening were said to happen like this. Upton and Stevens had caught up with Patsy and were in the barn together. On and off during the night, they would leave the barn to see if the residents in the fodder house were asleep yet. Before the dawn broke the next morning, Upton and Stevens left the O'Neill residence. They walked through the woods, drinking the rest of their whiskey. Both were wearing white clothes, and there was no blood spotted on either man. On their way home, they passed through a thick settlement. They told the residents that they had slept out in the woods overnight. They also stated that they had stayed at Upton's elderly uncle's home. Upton would testify that he made these statements to prevent their wives from finding out that they had been spending time with Patsy. The events of Saturday, September 12th, and Sunday, September 13th. Sometime during the evening hours of September 12th, the O'Neill's family home caught on fire. By the morning of Sunday, September 13th, the cabin had been reduced to ashes. Warning: this next section of the story is very graphic in nature and is read directly from the article from the Tennesean. Viewer discretion is advised. If you wish to skip this section of how the destruction of the house and how the bodies were found, please skip to the next timestamp. The following is from the January 31st, 1849, the Tennesean. Quote, on Sunday morning, the blank day of September 1846, Patsy Troxdale, then Patsy O'Neill, returned to her father's house. After spending the preceding night at a neighbor's, a Mrs. Householder, who accompanied her home, they found the small cabin in which the O'Neill family lived nearly reduced to ashes, and after looking into the building ruins, they could discover several dead bodies heaped together in a small hole or cellar underneath the floor. Patsy thought she recognized the bodies laying on top as those of her father and mother. Several of the neighbors assembled during the day, but no effort to remove the bodies was made until the next day, when a jury of inquest was assembled by the coroner of the county, and the proceedings taken to investigate the transaction. The bodies were dug out of the ruins and were found to be 7 in number and were identified as the bodies of Edward O'Neill and his wife and their 5 children, ranging from the age of 14 or 15 down to a child of only 2 years old. Patsy Troxdale was the only survivor of the family. The bodies were all badly burned, with the exception of those 2 youngest children, which lay at the bottom of the pit. The heads and extremities of the old man and his wife were burned off, and those of the children, except as above, were so injured by the fire as to destroy entirely their natural appearance. No marks of violence could be discovered on the parts remaining, except in the case of the 2 youngest children, whose heads seemed to have been crushed in places as if with an axe. Skippers, or maggots the size of a grain of wheat, were found in the body of the youngest child. An axe was discovered sticking in the stump of a tree, with spots of blood on the handle, and on the wood where it went through the eye of the axe. Some of the few hairs, like those of a child, were noticed by some of the witnesses adhering to this instrument." Unquote. Questions about the crime scene. We understand that this was a very graphic description of the crime scene, and there are many who have skipped it and now are rejoining us. But we have to wonder how long the bodies were in the pit for the youngest child to have maggots already. And we have to ask, where are the heads of the parents? Were they in the pit? Were they turned to ash? Or were they somewhere else? While these questions won't be answered, it is something that could have been important to the case. As it was, the job will be a little harder to find out who actually did the crime. The placement of the bodies was also a little odd. Why were the children placed at the bottom of the cellar and not the parents? Could they have been placed in order of their death? But this would not make sense, as the hair of the child was found on the axe. Or was there a reason why Edward and Sarah were placed last? There are other questions which we cannot have answers to, but the placement does speak to the mindset of the person who was responsible. How the newspapers reported the murders. We have found many articles using the same perspective written over and over. We are quoting the most clear available source when it comes to this article, coming from the American Republican and Baltimore Daily Clipper, dated October 12, 1846. Quote, "Dreadful tragedy. Murders and suicide. The Louisville Journal says that on the 19th ult in Overton County, Tennessee, a brute in human form named Edward O'Neill murdered his wife and 5 of his children, set his house on fire, and then committed suicide, throwing himself upon the horrid pile of murdered victims. It is scarcely necessary to say that the man was a habitual drunkard and was drunk at the time. His daughter of 16 escaped the general massacre." Unquote. A little bit of shorthand on the newspapers. Newspapers have limited space, so a lot of abbreviations will be used for terms. ULT is short for ultimo, which literally means previous or last month. The article really gives us a huge clue as to how the investigation was going initially. It was initially thought that in a drunken rage, Edward O'Neill did the familicide. Evidently, Edward O'Neill was well known to be violent if he was drinking, especially toward his own family members. And since he had been violent before, it stood to reason that he would be the main suspect. But did he do it? The coroner's inquest. Sometime during the evening hours of September 12th, the O'Neill family home caught on fire. By the morning of Sunday, September 13th, the cabin had been reduced to ashes. Now, the gruesome task was at hand to discover who did the murders and why. The coroner first investigated the area to find all of the evidence that was available. Then, he held an inquest. Now, we admit that we do not have the official date of the inquest or how long it took for the jury to investigate the crime. But we do know for sure that the inquest had taken place sometime between the afternoon of Sunday, September 13th, and Tuesday, September 15th. First, let's present the alibi that Patsy initially reported. We will now go back to the Tennesean for this part of the story. Quote, upon examination before the jury, Patsy deposed that her father had threatened to turn her out of his house on Saturday, and had thrown out her plunder, which she and her mother conveyed to an outhouse some 200 yards from the family residence, in which there was some fodder. That her father afterwards choked her mother and committed other acts of violence towards her, and sent her, Patsy, off to Miss Householder, with directions to spend the night there, and to tell Mrs. H. to come to his house in the morning, and he would tell her where her husband, who it seems had run off, had gone to. That she, Patsy, went accordingly to Mrs. Householder's, remained all night, and brought her home with her the next day, when they discovered the house to be on fire and nearly consumed. She had stated that Upton and Stevens, her co-defendants, had been to her father's on Friday and had given him liquor. The jury of inquest discovered several articles in the fodder house or outhouse mentioned above, all of which defendant Patsy claimed as hers, having been brought from money she obtained from singing, hunting, and selling ginseng. The defendant Patsy was taken under arrest by a constable and kept for a few days at his house, but was then permitted to go at large. She lived in the fodder house by herself for some time, and then went to her uncle's in Kentucky, where she married and remained until taken upon requisition from the governor of this state and brought back to Overton County sometime in March 1846. Unquote. Mrs. Householder's part of the story. First thing that struck us was the name Householder. Was this a real person or a name used to hide her identity? Well, in this case, we are not for sure. It turns out that there is an Anglo-Saxon surname of Householder. It simply means to hold a religious house or convent. It is also the Americanized version of the German surname Hochschleder. So the surname could be a real one, even though we do not have the lady's first name. There are some other things that we glean from this article. The first would be to get a little bit more information as to why Patsy O'Neill was staying all night in the barn or shed. Evidently, according to Patsy, there had been a huge fight between Patsy, Edward, her father, and Patsy's mother. This fight escalated to violence against the two women. Patsy was basically told to get off the property and stay with Mrs. Householder and give her a message to come to the O'Neill farm the next day. Evidently, Edward had information as to where Mrs. Householder's husband was now located. Both women came back to the house together, and the house was now in ashes. Now, we can see two sides to this. It does seem very convenient for Patsy to be sent to a neighbor's home for the night. And, to ensure that the neighbor returned with Patsy to the scene of the crime, a message was sent for her to come to the cabin the next day. This could serve as Mrs. Householder was now a witness that Patsy was elsewhere when the crime happened. On the other hand, the events could have taken place exactly as Patsy had dictated. But as any good detective will tell you, a little questioning will make a false alibi fall apart. Patsy's belongings and first arrest. One of the things that must have stood out to the coroner and those that were investigating the crime scene is that all of Patsy's things were not in the cabin that was burned down. Patsy's belongings were in the building in which she was staying. Patsy admitted that all of the belongings were in fact hers and that she purchased them with her own money. She was selling the ginseng that she was finding for profit. Now, we have to say that this does look pretty suspicious. If you are planning on burning down a building, you would pretty well make sure that anything that you wish to keep would be kept away from danger, wouldn't you? You would also make sure that you had an airtight alibi for the time that the building was noticed to be up in flames. I'm sure that both of these things were taken into consideration when it came to Patsy O'Neill at that time. It was at this point in the story that Patsy O'Neill was first taken into custody by the constable, and she had to stay under house arrest at his residence. She was given the freedom to come in and out of the house and mingle with the population of the community as she pleased, but she had to stay at the constable's home. She was eventually allowed to go back to the building that she was staying in and live there for some time. The second arrest in Kentucky. It is not clear when Patsy O'Neill left the state of Tennessee. However, it seems that she did indeed leave the state to reside with an uncle who lived in Kentucky. While in Kentucky, she met and married a man named Troxdale. We currently could not find his first name, nor exactly when they married, or if this marriage was out of love or convenience. If the marriage was from convenience, what did Troxdale know? We do know that Troxdale did not testify at the trial. Kentucky State Governor William Owsley, who served from September 4, 1844 through September 6, 1848, was given a requisition concerning Troxdale. She therefore was arrested in the state and brought back to the state of Tennessee for trial in March of 1847 to 1848. The year is not clear because of the timing in the newspaper articles states that it happened before the murders had taken place. The arrest of the co-conspirators. Now, it was not unusual for women to be arrested for their crimes back in the 1840s. However, it was very hard to get a conviction against them. To put this in a little context, this happened during the rule of Queen Victoria, who ruled from June 1837 until her death in 1901. She made sweeping changes to the law of the land of England, which kind of spilled over into the attitudes of the people of the United States. In an era where women were considered to be too weak and or meek to commit murder, and if they did, it was thought that they would use underhanded methods such as poison or killing a man in his sleep. It was thought impossible for a woman to chop up a person and then set fire to their corpse in such a defiling way. It was as impossible as a mountain growing legs and walking away. We will see a lot of this attitude in the way the Tennesean speaks about the evidence of the crime. The first jury trial. First, let's read what the Tennesean had to say about the first trial witnesses and evidence. Upon the trial, some witnesses spoke of the old man O'Neill reprehending Patsy for her lewd blank, and of Patsy's having to use some threats against her father on account of his abuse and harsh treatment of her. But there was no evidence of any ill feeling on her part towards her mother or her brothers and sisters. At the time of the supposed murder, Patsy was about 18 years of age. The proof introduced against her was entirely circumstantial and too minute to be detailed. Several witnesses were introduced by the defendant to show that old man O'Neill was a violent and dangerous man when in liquor. A heathenish man, to use the language of 2 or 3 of the witnesses. One witness proved that Patsy came after him on one occasion to pacify her father, who was treating his family with great brutality. That on his way to O'Neill's, he heard a gunfire, and upon going to the house, he found O'Neill's wife crying, and she said in the presence of her husband that the load of the gun had passed near her through a crack of the house. Another witness testified that O'Neill had confessed to him that he had once attempted to take his own life, and showed him a hole in his ear, which he said had been made by a bullet in the attempt to commit the act. Upon this state of facts, the counsel for the defendant Patsy, Sam Turney, Esquire, after acquiring the points of law involved in the case and insisting upon the insufficiency of the evidence to sustain the conviction, very ingeniously and ably contended that this horrible tragedy had been perpetrated by the old man in one of his mad fits, that the very nature of the transaction, the murder of the whole family down to the infant almost in the cradle, demonstrated that it could only have been committed by a madman. No adequate cause had been shown why any of the defendants had perpetrated so fell a crime. That it was inconceivable a child of the age of 18, a girl, could, as it were, in the moment, have steeped herself so dimly in the crime as to murder her father, mother, brothers, and sisters, and have gone to work so systematically to conceal it, even if she were able physically to have consummated the act herself. That it was equally inconceivable that she could have induced either or both of the defendants, Upton and Stevens, without any enmity against the O'Neill family, and without any hope of gain, the family being of the very poorest, to aid her in the commission of so hellish an act. That the mysterious nature of the case could only be accounted for by the supposition mentioned, and that the annals of crime were filled with cases equally hideous and fearful as the present, the acts of sudden or continued insanity, but that no parallel could be found of acts of deliberate crime performed without adequate motive and not in the heat of passion. Unquote. Now, wait a minute. We have several defense witnesses to state that Edward O'Neill was well known in the community to be abusive toward his family, that he was even prone to extreme violence against them. We also have the fact that the Tennesean itself says that there was so little evidence against Patsy that it really didn't need to be mentioned in the article. So, what was the evidence? At this time, it has not been revealed. But we do have what the defense has to say about Upton and Stevens. Reading again from the Tennesean. Quote, in regard to defendants Upton and Stevens, the proof showed that they had made an assiduation with the defendant, Patsy, to meet them in the fodder house on Friday night before the burning, that they spent the night with her at the place designated, that they left about daylight, went through a thickly settled neighborhood openly, breakfasted within a mile or two of the place at a friend's, and were seen going in the direction of home some 5 or 6 miles on their way, about 12 o'clock of the day. They were dressed in white clothes, and no mark of blood was noticed upon them or on any of the articles found in the fodder house. No enmity or ill feeling was shown to have existed on their part against O'Neill or his family. They stated at first to different persons, when asked where they spent the night on Friday, that they had slept out on the mountain. But Upton afterwards frequently admitted that he had stayed at the fodder house, and that he had told a different story because he did not want his wife to know of his intimacy with Patsy. Both Stevens and Upton remained in the country after the date of the burning as before. Upton was proved to have sustained a good character to the period in question. The jury found the defendants all guilty as charged. They moved for a new trial, and upon its being refused, appealed to the Supreme Court. Unquote. Possible reason behind the guilty verdict. We do have a report given to us about the verdict and how people read it in the newspapers of the time. The New York Herald, dated January 26, 1849. Quote, Patsy A. Troxdale, Nicholas Stevens, and William E. Upton had been convicted at Nashville, Tennessee, of the murder of the O'Neill family, which was committed in Overton County, Tennessee, on the 1st of September, 1846. Unquote. From the way the Tennesean reads so far, we can surmise that the only reason why the 3 people were found guilty of this crime is because they happened to be at the residence during the time frame of the murders. And even the cover-up as to where Upton and Stevens were was explained. Neither man wanted to tell their wives that they were at Patsy's home having a good time that night. It seems that the unexplained evidence against Troxdale, Stevens, and Upton was pretty damning. If they weren't guilty, they certainly acted guilty. There was a call for a new trial, which was denied. So, the defense sent their case up to the Tennessee Supreme Court for a decision on the matter. First things first. We will begin with the plea for a new trial before the Supreme Court of Tennessee. For reference, the following evidence was found in the Tennessee Reports, page 257. We have left a link to this in the description box below. Quote, Troxdale, et L.V., the State. Nashville, December 1848. New trial in a criminal case because of the incompetency of a juror. Affidavits. A new trial should be granted upon a conviction for murder. On the affidavit of two persons that one of the jurors had told them before the trial that from the best information he could get, he was of opinion the defendants ought to be hung. Citing Overton v. State, Migas 262, and cited in Brakefield v. State, 1 Sneed 219. New trial, charge of court. In a doubtful case, although the charge of court may not be anything erroneous, yet if it not be sufficiently clear and explicit on a matter of law about which the jury may have been misled, the Supreme Court will grant a new trial. As where the judge announced correctly the general principle applicable to testimony corroborative of that of an impeached witness, but failed to inform the jury what kind of testimony would be in law be corroborative. Cited in Crawford v. State, 4 Code W. 195. 411. Patsy Troxdale, Nicholas Stevens, and William Upton were indicted for the murder of Edward O'Neill and Sarah O'Neill, his wife, and their 5 children on the 15th day of September, 1846. The persons murdered were the father, mother, brothers, and sisters of the defendant, Patsy Troxdale. The murder is charged in the indictment to have been committed with an axe. The defendants pleaded jointly not guilty, and a jury was impaneled by the presiding judge, Marchbanks, to try them jointly, and the proof was submitted accordingly. Unquote. So, now we know a little bit more about the grounds for the appeals that the lawyer chose to take to the Supreme Court of Tennessee. It seems that there were some discrepancies in the trial that needed to be addressed. But first, let's go over the evidence that the Tennesean overlooked and called minute. Items found inside of the burnt cabin. The entire building, it seems, had not burned down to the ground. There were still some items that were found in and around the site, and we have a list of what they were. Turning to the Tennessee Reports, page 257, we read the following. Quote, in the fodder house were found various articles. A dress filled with old feathers, another filled with cotton and woolen thread. In the loft, a quilt. There was also a box found which contained a testament in which was a deed to her father for the land on which he resided. In a top stack near the house was a spinning wheel, and in the weeds there was found a bed tick, which Patsy took off immediately when it was discovered. There was blood on her petticoat and chemise. Unquote. Let's go over these things a little. A dress filled with feathers and another one used to store cotton and woolen thread? Why? Unless the stored items were used for making things like quilts and pillows for the family. But it does seem a little unusual to keep the feathers, woolen thread, and cotton in a dress. Unless the dresses were old and no longer wearable and repurposed as a container. Some Appalachian women take old baby clothes and aprons and make clothespin hangers with them. I do this myself instead of throwing out the no longer usable garment. And another thing that could be connected with these items is that Mrs. O'Neill might have sold these things on the market to make extra money. How do we know this? By the finding of the spinning wheel. While we could not find a modern translation of a top stack, we can maybe guess that this was a refuge pile. That maybe Patsy resented that she had to help her mother spin thread. What could have been seen by Patsy's mother as a way to provide income for the family could have been seen as useless waste of time to her daughter. For all we know, Mrs. O'Neill could have been storing up the extra cotton, woolen thread, and feathers to sell at the market. It would have made sense if she did this to barter for material for quilts and clothing, or to sell outright to other ladies to have money to help with the expenses of running a household. It would not be that unusual to find a quilt in the loft. In the winter months, a lot of people use the lofts to sleep in because of heat rises. And to keep warm during the bitter Appalachian cold months of the year, heat is an essential asset for survival. And this happened to be in the early part of September. It is not out of the realm of possibility that in 1846 September was getting chilly, and so everyone was starting to move up into their lofts to sleep at night. But here's the thing. The quilt was left, but the bed tick was missing. Why? We get into that in a minute. A box that contained a testament. Bibles were a family's most prized possession. Old Bibles are passed down from generation to generation. They often contain the births and death records of family members. However, did the box belong to Edward, his wife Sarah, or to Patsy? And who placed the deed in the box, and why? This piece of evidence will be important to the conviction of Patsy Troxdale, because it seems that this might have been one of the motives behind the murders. We will get more into the box and the testimony a little later in the story. The last thing that was found was a bed tick in the weeds. A bed tick is not a small insect. In fact, they are often called tick mattresses. They are a large bag of stiff, tightly woven fabric that is filled with straw or other materials to put on a bed to lay on. These are often used in string beds to help soften the bed when the person is laying down on the strings instead of a box spring. So, why is it laying out in the weeds? There could be a couple of explanations. These were very hard to come by unless you made them yourself. It could be that Patsy thought of this as a luxury item. It also could be that this was her way of throwing her family out into the dust. It is very telling that the family mattress was thrown out to the weather, where it could have gotten wet and damaged. But then again, if she took it to where she was sleeping, it could have pointed a finger as to motive. But it is also very telling that when it was found, she took off immediately. Did it contain something that Patsy didn't want to be found by those who were looking for evidence? The last sentence in the paragraph says a whole lot. Quote, there was blood on her petticoat and chemise, unquote. Now, I am pretty sure that Patsy was not asked to take her dress off in front of the whole community. Were the items found inside of the bed tick, or were they found in her belongings? Or was Patsy asked to remove her outer clothing in front of a group of women? We simply do not know. But the findings of the blood on her underclothes do certainly point to her being a criminal behind the crime of murder. And we are pretty sure that the location and the amount in which the blood was found couldn't be explained away by monthly periods. The testimony of Christina Hensley. We are not told the reason why Christina Hensley was behind bars, only that she herself will tell us that she had been there a long time, and that she talked to and shared a cell with Troxdale. We looked up Hensley in all of the Tennessee prison and Nashville jail records that are currently available online. We also turned to the newspapers online to help in finding out who she was and what she did. Currently, there is no Christina Hensley that fits this description online. But we do have her testimony documented in the Tennessee records, source listed down below. It reads the following statement. Quote, Christina Hensley, a witness for the state, stated that she was then in custody and had been for some time in jail with Patsy Troxdale, that she knew nothing about the matter of the murder, that she had forgotten all that she had known or said about it, that she had forgotten her own children, and, after threats used and much hesitation, she stated that Patsy had said to her in jail that her father, mother, brothers, and sisters were killed on Friday night. That, quote, the boys Upton and Stevens were clear of it, unquote. That she burned down the house on Saturday evening, that they were killed with an axe, that Patsy would sometimes tell her one tale, sometimes another. Half a dozen citizens testified that they would not believe Christina Hensley on her oath, unquote. As we can see, there were problems with this testimony. Let's take it apart, shall we? The flags in Christina's testimony. The first flag is how long had Troxdale and Hensley been cellmates. We are pretty sure that the inmates were told the current date and kept up with things like court dates and appeals to their cases. As many people who have been in jail can tell you, they know exactly how long they have been in custody. Very rarely do days there run together. The second red flag here is that she knew nothing of the murder that was in question and that she had forgotten all that she had known or said about it. Now, this was a pretty sensational case, and we're pretty sure that the jailers were talking about it. And we do not know when Hensley was taken into custody. So it is pretty likely that if she was not in a jail cell by then, that she would have heard about the case. So, for this part of the statement to be made by Hensley is a pretty unlikely scenario. And she tells us as much in the second half of her statement, that she had forgotten. Why would she make that statement unless something else was at play here? The third flag would be that she tells the court that she can't remember her own children. Why would Hensley make that statement? Mothers never forget their children. They may act like they do. They may even abandon them or not care for them. But they definitely remember giving birth to them. Now, granted, she may not know what they currently look like, as she had been in jail for some time. But her statement is a little over the top to be believed. We are pretty sure that Christina Hensley was setting everything up, that she was not going to testify willingly. And she pretty well tells us so in the next statement, quote, after threats used and much hesitation, unquote. Now who and why are making threats against Hensley? Was it Troxdale, that if she spoke a word of what was said in the cell, that she would come after her? Was it the prosecution, that they knew she had information that would make their case? We find it very interesting that these words were listed among the testimony. Hensley also goes on to tell us that sometimes Patsy would tell her stories about what went on that fateful day, and sometimes these stories did not line up with each other. So did Hensley believe anything that Troxdale told her? Was she saying that nothing that Troxdale was stating to the court was the truth? What did Hensley know that she was refusing to divulge to the court? We will simply never know. But it is interesting that Hensley left us with all of these clues. The judge charged to the jury. First, let us read once again from the Tennessee reports concerning the testimony of Christina Hensley. Quote, the judge charged the jury, in reference to the testimony of Christina Hensley, that a witness may be discredited by her statements, by her mode of delivering her testimony, and by witness declaring that they would not believe her on her oath. From her general character, that it was the providence of the jury to determine whether this witness had been discredited or not. He also stated to them that from any cause they thought her not entitled to credit, her testimony should altogether be discarded. Yet, if her testimony had been in so many material points corroborated by other reliable and credible testimony, either positive or circumstantial, as to awaken the conviction that her testimony was independent of any belief reposed in her statements, true, then it would be competent to give her credit, unquote. The judge makes it pretty clear that the jury had options when it came to the testimony of Christina Hensley. In the first scenario, we are given the reasons why the jury can disregard her testimony, that they could use the statements from other witnesses that she was untrustworthy, by her own statements, by the way that she delivered her testimony, or from her general character. That the jury could use their own deductions to throw out this testimony from their deliberations if they saw fit. However, on the flip side of the coin, the judge also made leeway for Hensley to be believed if her testimony lined up with other credible witnesses or evidence in the case, even if either of these had been positive or circumstantial. Then they could use her testimony in their deliberations. Thoughts about Hensley. While we do not have all the testimony from Hensley, we do get a glimmer of what she testified to. That Troxdale said that she had acted alone, that Upton and Stevens had not helped her in any of the crime. We tend to think that the telling of one tale and then another was actually the same disjointed tale. When dealing with something that is very traumatizing as the murder of your own family, we feel that somewhere inside of Troxdale just broke. That in her own disjointed way, she was trying to tell at least someone what really happened that night, even if she could never say it publicly. We will never know for sure how or when the threats between Patsy and her father Edward went over the edge, when they pushed each other too far. But if we are to believe Christina Hensley in her testimony, it did reach the point of no return, and Patsy did the crime all by herself. If we are not to believe Hensley, then Upton and Stevens were just as guilty as Troxdale. The objections. There were actually 5 rulings, but 3 objections were actually numbered. First, we will read from pages 258 through 259 of the Tennessee reports from the written down version of the defense case. Quote, there was a motion made for a new trial, and in support of this motion, there was read an affidavit of the coroner, which stated that in his testimony he had failed to state the explanation of the defendant Troxdale in regard to the fact that the deed to her father's for land had been found in her box. To wit, that she said that her father wished to sell it, and her mother had deposited it there to prevent him from selling it. 2. The affidavit of Troxdale stated that a juror, Shelton, had sworn that he had not formed or expressed an opinion as to her guilt or innocence, when he had both formed and expressed an opinion, and that he had got himself placed on the jury with the intent to convict the defendants. 3. The affidavits of Swallows and Bellew. The affidavit of Swallows states that some months before the trial, Shelton declared to him that from the best information he could get, the defendants ought to all be hung for the offense with which they are charged. The affidavit of Bellew states that Shelton declared some 3 or 4 months before the trial that the defendants ought to be punished, or would be punished, for the murder charged against them. This motion, being argued duly considered, was overruled, and the judgment rendered against the defendants on the verdict for murder in the first degree. From the judgments, the defendants appealed. S. Turley, Savage, and Garden Hare for plaintiffs in error. Attorney General for the state. Turley J. delivered the opinion of the court. The prisoners, Patsy Troxdale, William E. Upton, and Nicholas Stevens stand convicted of the crime of murder in the first degree by the judgment of the Circuit Court of the County of Overton, and to be reversed, which they have prosecuted their wit of error to this court. The murder, for the commission of which these persons have been condemned, can scarcely be paralleled in the annals of crime for savage and remorseless cruelty, for wanton and unprovoked malignity, for cool and deliberate malice, and a thirst for blood to have been looked for only in beasts of prey, and, withal, attended with circumstance so strange and mysterious, so unaccountable, according to any ordinary principle of human action, and involving in the guilt of its perpetration a person so connected with the victims that it is horrible to think of, and the mind starts appalled from its contemplation. Unquote. These were very shocking allegations against the witness, jury, and prosecution. But let's take these one by one. The box. The first on the list is a box that contained the deed to Edward O'Neill's land. Contained in the evidence, as we have explained before, was a small box that contained a testament and the deed. The thought of the coroner was that Patsy had committed the murders to gain financially from the sale of the land or to take possession of the land herself. But could that have been the only reason behind her having the deed? We will get into that in a moment. For some reason, the point of objection was not addressed by the Supreme Court, although other evidence had to be addressed, and we are sure that this is not an oversight by the court. Perhaps it may have been a lack of time, or the court felt that in light of the other evidence, that this objection was not relevant to the case at hand. It could have been that in his drunken states, O'Neill had threatened to sell the land and walk away from his family. Or it could have been that he used the deeds countless times to state that he would throw out his family to the streets, and there was nothing that Sarah O'Neill could do about it. We simply do not know if Sarah gave the deed to her daughter to hide it from her husband, or if Patsy took the deed for future use. The court addresses malice. Now, we are going to state this before we get started in this section. The views of the women and children who murder their families is from 1848. There are several cases today of child mass murderers and of children killing their families for monetary gain or freedom from abusive situations. Many of these cases are brutal in nature. However, in 1848, the idea of this happening was inconceivable. So, do as I did during this section of the story. Take in a huge breath, let it out, and roll your eyes. In this section of the case, the court takes a moment to address the possible malice in the crimes. It recognizes that Troxdale, Stevens, and Upton did not have any reason to plan and commit the crime. That it is in the court's opinion that this is an act of savageness and the thirst for blood could not apply to the defendants. That, simply put, they did not believe that Patsy could have coldly killed her entire family over an argument with her father. That Patsy did not have any ill will or arguments toward her mother or siblings. That this would not have been enough for her to carry out this vicious act, and there was no other motive that could have stood up to scrutiny. The Supreme Court also ruled that since Patsy could not have done this act by herself, then it would have also had to address the guilt or innocence of Stevens and Upton. That both men would not have committed this crime by themselves because they had nothing to gain from it. They did not have any malice toward the O'Neill family. So, if Patsy is taken out of the equation of the murders, then Stevens and Upton would have to be removed as well. The court then goes on to address if O'Neill did this crime by himself. The court ruled that it was impossible for Edward O'Neill to have physically killed his family, then set fire to the cabin, then killed himself because of the evidence presented. The court then went on to state that the case was far too complex to understand it completely, that there was simply not enough evidence to convict the three defendants at the time based on what was presented to the jury. The objection concerning juror William Shelton. Let's go back a little. Objection number 2 had to do with a juror named Shelton. The accusation was that the juror had himself placed upon the jury with the intent to convict those who were accused of the crime. That William Shelton had formed and expressed an opinion concerning the case before the trial, and hid this fact from the court. So, turning to the Tennessee reports, we find the ruling about Shelton. Quote, the case being, in my humble opinion, thus involved, it becomes highly necessary that we should scrutinize, with great partiality, the proceedings in the court below, and require the utmost strictness in the observance of all those forms and requisites prescribed by the law for the maintenance of the purity of the trial and safety of the accused. It is a case in which most calm and deliberate investigation and examination should be demanded on the part of the court and jury. One in which the verdict and judgment of the conviction ought not to be sustained if the jury who try the case are not above all exceptions, and the testimony of all such a character as not to make false impressions or induce false inductions. It is a case, above all others that we have seen, which requires the coolest and most enlightened and most impartial jurors for its trial, which demands of the judge the most rigid scrutiny and investigation of the legality of the testimony on the part of the court, and the clearest exposition of its nature and tendency. It is a case in which neither this court nor the community should be satisfied to execute the prisoners, nor any one of them, unless it were apparent that these things all concurred in the trial in the court below. We cannot say that they did. We do not think that William Shelton, one of the jurors who tried the case, was bonus probus et eligus homo exceptione major. As the law requires that he should have been, he had, in our judgment, prejudged the case. Unquote. Oh, the Supreme Court was not happy at all with the news that one of the jurors, William Shelton, had purposely got himself onto the jury to convict the defendants. That the court felt that the jury should be impartial to render a fair and just verdict. That they should be cool-headed and examine each piece of evidence with the utmost unbiased eye. In the court opinion, the judges write that in all cases, the jury should maintain the strictest adherence to the law. This was for the purity of the trial, as well as the safety of those who stood accused of the crime. That if there was one juror that was found not to have the purest of intentions of finding the truth of the case, then the conviction of those that stood accused should not be upheld. That the community would not have justice satisfied if one of the defendants were falsely accused of the crime. The Supreme Court felt that it did not happen with the case of Shelton, that they found that he was not bonus probus et eligus homus omni exceptione major. Now, what in the heck does that mean? Probus et legalis homo means a good and lawful man. Omni exceptione major is a Latin term used in Scots law, which means beyond all exception. So, if we put that all together, the judges were saying that a juror should be a good and lawful man who is beyond all exception. And they felt that Shelton did not qualify in this case, that he in fact violated the purity of the product of the jury with his willingness to pervert the judgment by his preconceived perception of the guilt of the defendants. The ruling concerning the affidavits of Andrew Swallows and Benjamin Belleu. The affidavits of Andrew Swallow and Benjamin Belleu held an overwhelming amount of weight to the Tennessee Supreme Court. We will read what was said about the affidavits in the Tennessee reports. Quote, the affidavit of Andrew Swallows shows that some months before the session of the court at which the case was tried, the juror told him that from the best information he could get, he was of the opinion that the defendants ought to be hung for the offense wherewith they were charged. That the affidavit of Benjamin Belleu shows that the same juror, 3 or 4 months before the trial, told him that the defendants ought to or would be punished for the offense from which he was informed. If these 2 witnesses speak the truth, and there is no reason to doubt them, then the juror William Shelton was not an impartial juror, but must have gone upon the trial of the case with a preconceived opinion of the guilt of the prisoners, and he must have gone on the trial with bad motives. For he was examined upon the voir dire with a view to his challenge. Cropper affected him and denied that he had formed such an opinion. Unquote. The court continues for 2 pages about how the sanctity of the court and its jury system should be held to the highest standard, and how, in the court's opinion, William Shelton had sullied the case that the state had against the 3 defendants. The Supreme Court goes on to say that if the opinions and actions of William Shelton had been known to the judge of the case, that they were pretty sure that the case would have been thrown out because of a mistrial. Though this would be a part of their final ruling, they did not fault the judge for a lack of knowledge about William Shelton. The ruling concerning Christina Hensley. Now, this is interesting. The Supreme Court does not fault the first judge for the ruling he made concerning the testimony of Christina Hensley. In fact, he calls it proper in a couple of places. However, they do feel that his instructions to the jury were confusing and misleading. We again read in the Tennessee reports, quote, though this charge is legally correct, yet in deliberating upon this subject, the jury may have been misled by not having informed what kind of testimony would be corroborative of the testimony of Christina Hensley, proving a confession of guilt on the part of Patsy Troxdale, and may have supposed that any testimony going to establish her guilt outside of her confession would be corroboration of the testimony of Christina Hensley as to the confession. Now, this would be a great error. For, though confession establishes guilt, the corpus delicti being proven, and therefore corroborates other proof of such guilt, yet a proof or proofs of guilt by no manner of means can establish the fact of a confession of guilt or corroborate any evidence of such confession. For a person may be proven most clearly to be guilty and yet never confess. There is no such connection between guilt and confession as to constitute proof of the one. Any corroborative evidence of the truth of the statement that the other was made. Evidence that would be corroborative of the truth of such statement should have some relation and connection with the making of the confession, and must be of such character as could raise a presumption that such confession had been made. We say that, from the neglect of the judge in drawing this distinction, the jury may have supposed that other credible proof of guilt was corroborative evidence of the truth of the witness, and have been thereby induced to believe that the confession was made as detailed by her, the consequence of which necessarily would have been a conviction. We do not know that we would have been reversed upon this ground solely, but it strengthens our dissatisfaction with the result of this trial, and makes us more anxious in this case should again be submitted to a jury, under the hope that further light might be shed upon this terrible transaction, and a result arrived at a more satisfactory than the present, not only to ourselves, but to the community. Unquote. So, in other words, the Supreme Court itself did not believe that Patsy Troxdale did confess to Christina Hensley. And if she did, then Hensley is still not to be believed on the fact that she has a very bad reputation, that there should have been a second witness to the confession for it to stand, that, as it was, the testimony of Hensley should have been discounted in the trial. The rulings as handed down by Tennessee Supreme Court Justice William B. Turley. The Supreme Court Justice William B. Turley wrote that it was the ruling of the court that the case should be overturned and a new trial granted. This ruling stood on several factors. 1. That the juror, William Sheldon, had indeed made sure to get himself onto the jury with a preconceived notion that the defendants were guilty of the crime and should receive the death penalty as prescribed by the law at the time. 2. That Swallows and Balayu had told the truth in their affidavits, and that the sanctity of the trial was now in question. For that reason, a new trial should be ordered. 3. That the malice of the case was not proven against Troxdale, Upton, and Stevens. That none of the three defendants had a reason to murder the O'Neill family in the manner that they did. Neither did they have a reason to burn down the family home. That it was simply a matter of their proximity to the location of the crime that the jury found them guilty. 4. That the testimony of Christina Hensley should never have been allowed in the court record. Or, if it had been, then the jury instructions should have been made more clear as to how the jury should regard her testimony. The dissent ruling, as handed down by Tennessee Supreme Court Justice J. Nathan Green. The Supreme Court Justice J. Nathan Green also delivered the following opinion about the case from the Tennessee reports. Quote, in the opinion of my brother Turley, in this case, a doubt seems to be indicated whether the defendant Patsy Troxdale is guilty of the murder charged in the indictment. The expression of that doubt constrains me to say that I do not concur in the expressions contained in the preliminary observations of the opinion. Upon the facts in this record, I should feel no disposition to disturb the verdict as to the defendant Troxdale, but I concur in awarding a new trial upon the ground that Sheldon was not an impartial juror. I also think that the judge was not sufficiently clear and explicit in stating the law as to what would be a corroboration of Christina Hensley's evidence. Therefore, I think there should be a new trial. Unquote. So, while Green did not completely agree with the Turley decision upon the case, he also felt that the case should be overturned and a new trial should take place. His opinion was solely based upon William Shelton and Christina Hensley. What happened after the trial? The following updates came from the Tennessee Bar Association. We would like to thank Russell Fowler for his diligence in finding out what happened in this case after the Supreme Court ruling. Troxdale, Upton, and Stevens were granted a new trial. While there were no further trial updates, we can either surmise that faced with overwhelming circumstantial evidence or the fact that the community was not about to let this go, the three could have pled guilty and got shorter sentences, which was the norm back then. In several of our feud cases, we have seen that people who want to avoid the gallows would plead guilty to receive shorter sentences. Think of it sort of like a plea deal today. According to Fowler and Putnam County historian Dale Welch, Patsy was jailed for a time and her services as a household laborer were rented out by authorities. According to an eyewitness who claimed to be at the bedside of Troxdale when she died, he stated the following, quote, this man was at Patsy Troxdale's deathbed. Patsy rolled back and forth saying, quote, I have to tell, unquote. She said she murdered her parents and 5 siblings with the help of the boys, William Upton and Nicholas Stevens, her paramours. She also confessed to another murder. She said she once happened upon a small boy in the woods with a bag of valuable ginseng he had dug. She killed the boy, took his ginseng, and fed his body to the hogs. Unquote. There is another update on Upton, that he apparently died during the Civil War, fighting on the side of the Confederacy. Tennessee Supreme Court Judge William B. Turley resigned his position in 1850 and served on the trial bench in Memphis. A year later, in Raleigh, Tennessee, while talking to a friend as they were exiting a hotel, Turley fell as his walking stick snapped into 2 pieces. The jagged piece ran through his chest next to his heart as he fell. 5 days later, Curly would die on May 27th, 1851, from the injury. As this case is ending today, we have to ask the question, who really killed the O'Neill family and why? While the questions we have will not be answered, as the evidence has long disappeared, we still have to wonder, did Patsy kill her family, and why? What did she hope to gain from the murders, and did she ever find peace in the end? Thank you. Kentucky Tennessee Living would like to thank you for watching our video series on the myths and legends of the Appalachian Mountains. Don't forget to hit that like button, as the more likes we receive, the more likely YouTube is to suggest our videos to other viewers. Also, to receive notice when we upload a new video, be sure to subscribe and click the bell notification button. Please be sure to double check that you are subscribed, as some of our viewers are finding that they are no longer subscribed to our channel. We thank you for continuing to support Kentucky Tennessee Living as we are discovering the mysteries in Appalachian history.